What's up, guys? Rocco. As you know, mechanic. Wrecks on cars, bike, my whole.
Thanks, Rocco.
Hey, Rocco. Hi, Rocco. I wanted us to have a song about freedom to root us in today's talk. The title is Freedom and Immortality. The centers talked about immortality, everybody's doing it. And before I get to that part of everybody's doing it, I wanted to root today, which is Easter Sunday, in the holidays that
Whole life. My buddy
this
told me,
time
supposedly
speaks to.
little thing.
So, as many of you may know, historically, the notion of Easter was connected with the story of the death and resurrection of a person named Jesus. And Jesus lived in the Jewish tradition, in the Hebrew tradition. And what he was celebrating at the time of this was the Passover. So I want us to root ourselves in what Jesus was rooting in, the notion of the Passover. And the Passover was all about freedom. There was years and years, generations, where people had been enslaved. And I think one of the things that happens is we can often put that to another part of our mind in terms of the history of slavery, when in fact there is a huge slave trade which is alive and well and flourishing today. There are countless people that get sold into servitude without any opportunity and with very little legal actions that can be taken on their behalf. That was a historical context of the Passover, that these people had been enslaved. And I've talked before about how Moses, who was an unknowing Jewish person, an unknowing Hebrew, because according to the story, he was raised by the Egyptians. He was raised by the very slave owners that we have. Now, how many of us sometimes find ourselves being raised by and held by our slave owners? I think it's an important question. How many of us find ourselves consciously or unconsciously enslaved? How many of us find that there are habits of mind? We just wake up and this is how the world is. Habits of thought, habits of attributions. I make the attribution that certain things will happen. And how many of us become worn out in those habits and worn down in those habits? So the notion of slavery, which can seem like a history that is long ago. I mean, I remember as a boy being told, don't think about slavery anymore. I remember an attribution that African Americans, slavery ended over 100 years ago. What's the big deal? The big deal is that slavery may have ended, but it got transformed into something else. It got transformed into what we've referred to now as the school to prison pipeline. That so many of our brown boys and girls end up going from school into prison. And that we end up going into prison, into slavery, when we fall unconscious, when we stop thinking and we stop having awareness. I think I talked about this a little bit before too. I hadn't realized, working in the school district, I knew that the south end of Seattle, where I serve, is very different than the north end of Seattle, where some of my other colleagues serve. And I found myself continually irritated There's a line in the second rendering of the Matrix where there are these two characters, and the one turns to the other and says, "We are feeling irritated." And I would always feel that way with respect to the notion that I really wanted to get more support for the students that were in the South End, because these were coming from families who work 3 and 4 jobs, or families who are homeless, or families that don't have a place that has predictability, a neighborhood where they don't feel safe walking to school, and so they don't come to school, or girls who are kept at home because they've got 4, 5, 6 younger siblings, and they're the one that's taking care of them. And I just found myself so irritated that that set of responsibilities was equalized with the notion of, well, I've got these basically pushy white families who just want to make sure that, they have me test their kids when their kids don't have anything wrong with them, but I still have to test them because the families could sue us if we don't test them. And even though I don't find anything, I still have to do the testing. And so it still takes time, it still takes work, it still takes effort. And to go to court with these white families that are suing for this. So I have found myself enslaved to an attitude of disgust, to an attitude of anger, to an attitude of irritation. And again, I don't know about, I do know that some of you, we have a certain person in political office that sends out 144 character comments on the cell phone any times of day or night, and they're typically something that tends to not uplift. It tends to put down, or it tends to make excuses, or it tends to, so I have this automatic attribution of an expectation. What's it going to say? What's going to be said today? What irritating thing is going to be bothering me today? The story of Passover was about a waking up, a breaking out of that slavery. Now, one of the big things that I was reading religious scholars identified with the difference between Passover and Easter, Passover was really about a community. It was about this whole community coming through a change, leaving behind a lifestyle of slavery. And the story goes, they were in the desert wandering around. Now, if you look at the geography, it's a 40-year journey, but you could have a really big crowd, and it's not likely to take 40 years to get from where they were to where they ended up. Most of us at our slowest pace would probably be able to make it faster than the 40 years. And the notion of that 40 years is that it just takes time to break through those habits. Now, don't use that as an excuse to say, oh, okay, so I've got 40 years. I can settle into this. I can have this. The notion was, and that's where it folds into Easter very well, is that those people had to be reborn. We have to be reborn out of our old habits of thought, out of our old attributions. So one of the things that has happened in response to that particular political figure, or that elected figure, is a lot of people have become energized. A lot of people have come forward with ideas about how to make the world a better place, about how to build up and treat with respect, how to look at the disavowal of some people and say, I'm going to do something different. Rather than putting some people down or saying some people are less, or using that as a means of motivating people. because it's really easy. How many of us have ever found ourselves, okay, so I'll own this. I have found that sometimes I've gotten so much sympathy out of my sorry stories. It's like I tell this story and I can just watch the concern come over people's faces. And, I've hooked them. I have them. But the problem is that I have locked myself into this position of pitifulness. Into this being an object of pity. So the story of Jesus, the notion of resurrected, some people have said that it's more a story of like individual experience. That Jesus as an individual, he was raised and praised last Palm Sunday. He's coming into town and he is the total winner. People are acknowledging and celebrating and thinking that, woohoo, the best one has arrived. All of our problems are solved. But within that, there was some backstabbing that was going on. One of his closest companions ostensibly exchanged knowledge about his whereabouts for 30 pieces of silver. So, in the story of Jesus comes in a celebratory means, shares a meal, shares that Passover, shares that celebration, that recollection, that history, that story of overcoming slavery, that overcoming of wandering those 40 years and coming together to form a new nation. And one of the things that Mykal and I saw was this Christ Church Cathedral in Victoria. And along the naves, they had the 14 Stations of the Cross. And the Stations of the Cross are basically this pictorial rendering of this story of Jesus' crucifixion and death. There's a power to these stories of crucifixion and death. One of the powers is recognizing where are we in our own processes. Where do we find ourselves getting crucified? How did we contribute to that process? Maybe we're being crucified by others. Maybe we're crucifying ourselves. Has anyone here ever crucified themselves? Mykal shared me the story of get off the wood. We need to use it for something, or get off the cross. We need the wood.
Oh.
So there are times that we are our own worst critics. There are times that we are really killing ourselves. What if there are times that we actually need to have a part of us die? That's what the story was in the Passover and the wandering around in the desert. Those old habits had to die. How many of us are willing to just put our arms out and be ready to die, to let that stuff die? How many of us are willing to let those certain elements go on the cross and be hung up, left to die? Ostensibly, one of the comments that Jesus made on the cross was, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." Can we let go? Cain made that comment about holding on. How much do we hold on to those habits, to those thoughts, to those ideas? The process of the crucifixion can be about opening our arms, opening it up, and just letting it die. Now, not many people look at that as a celebratory time. But this story of sacrifice, this story of letting go, it happens over and over and over and over again. I was trying to look up kind of a popular culture expression of the Passover, and they told the story, they pointed to the story of Shawshank Redemption. Shawshank Redemption is the story of a man who was accused of brutally murdering his wife and her lover, and being sent to prison for life for this. And he arrives in prison, and it's no picnic. And he, in this worst possible place, ends up making friends. He ends up being able to use his talents. He ends up being able to make himself absolutely essential. But in that making himself essential, he was also not a dumb person. He was actually planning the whole time how he was going to be getting out. There was a little bit of an impetus to that getting out. Someone ended up in the prison who had heard about the person who had murdered his wife. So there was the opportunity that he could get out. But the warden, rather than letting go of this essential person, made sure that that witness was killed. And with that, he was able to turn things around so that the warden met with his own just desserts. And he was discovered. I think it's Morgan Freeman plays his good friend. And Morgan has this apprehension that people have not gotten out well. And he ends up in this room when he does get out after years and years and years for some very small infraction. A little bit like Les Mis, if people are familiar with it.
Well, he did murder somebody.
But there were mitigating circumstances around it.
Yeah, but he still murdered somebody.
Yeah. But
Minor detail.
Okay.
I guess what I want to say is, though, the notion was that there was a belief that he would not survive getting out. That the only way was to stay in the prison. But his friend, who escaped, left him a clue for finding him. And he found him. What are the clues that are left for us? In the story of the Passover, again, it's this whole group of people. I would argue that actually an advancement in the Christ story is that it's about the resurrection of a community that makes the biggest difference. In that story of the Shawshank Redemption, it was those two who arrived at a different way of being and forged a community. In the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, what happens is that his followers encounter a major transformation in their own lives. It wasn't only about individual. A lot of Christian orientation is about the individual possibility of eternal life. There was another song that I was looking at. Michael didn't like it as well. But the notion of the song was that my freedom is also reliant on your freedom. Is also reliant on your freedom. I will never be free until everybody else is free. One of the things in the Buddhist tradition is the idea of a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is one who attains enlightenment But enlightenment for that individual ends up not being enough. Immortality for the individual is not enough. Because most of the stories of a heavenly city or a heavenly place is that we're going to reunite with people we've loved. It isn't the story of just going to hang out in a big mansion where we've got, a clicker where we can have whatever we want and it just shows up. Although that's a little bit like, if anybody's familiar with the show A Good Place.
Yeah.
The Good Place, there are these individuals who seem to have arrived at the good place, and they didn't live a life that deserved the good place. And they make their way through the good place in the context of each other. Check it out if you want to have a fun twist on heaven. The invitation with looking at immortality and eternality and the notion that everybody gets it is, how do we contribute to a good life and more life? How do we hold that as how we are living our life? The story of the Passover and the story of Easter is about the prospect of dying, letting things go, letting things pass. And it's about rising up beyond that. Not just overcoming our own individual hurdles, but about building things for others. About creating more and more spaces where heaven is what exists. Well, how do we do that? Sometimes it's as simple as making eye contact and really listening to somebody. Knowing that they have a story, and that just by listening, that story will have a place. It can come forward. I was telling Tanya, and I had the opportunity to have this beautiful conversation with this administrator who I just adored. And it just happened that I was able to hear from her some things that she's been going through. That there was nothing set up that the conversation would have gone there. It's just how it unfolded. I would propose that as we step forward into our daily encounters, that we can make ourselves places for these to unfold. We can make ourselves well holders of the life of others. I mean, I know that Tan, as a therapist, is holding the vision, the possibility that the client's lives can be better. And I would bet you, having served in a counseling position, sometimes people come to us and they want X, and we look at them and say, you don't really need X, you really need Y. But there's no amount of convincing. You know, let me tell you, anytime you try to convince people that they don't want X but they want Y, they go away.
Yeah.
So you just have to be present. Okay, you want X? Great, we'll work on X. And sometimes we've created the space where they do get X, but then they get to realize, oh, wait, I think Y would be really nice. And you, little therapist, and you can be like, yes. Or that listening friend. How many of us have had someone talk to us and they're like, oh, this thing is terrible? We know, you know what, sister, that isn't really the thing that's terrible. The thing that's terrible is really this. But I know better than to comment on that. Having done that, I did that with my sister. My sister was seeing somebody, and I said, you know, your relationship is just like our parents. Complete, you know, like, woo! There was a no conversation zone for a little while after that, because I had completely stepped into an unasked, uninvited location. And in retrospect, she has said, you were right. You were right, but sometimes our being right isn't what it's about. Our being right is not about immortality and extending heaven. Sometimes our being right is about stroking our own egos. And again, it's a little bit that notion of, are we willing to hang it on the cross? Are we willing to let our rightness die? I'd invite us to consider, okay, I'm willing to let my rightness, my righteousness about this, my huge genius that can see this situation with such clarity, and I'm simply bringing this clarity unto you. You know, this is a gift from my wisdom into your life. And can we put our arms and let that be crucified? It can be hard, because again, sometimes we really identify with that wisdom. We identify with that intelligence. We identify with the insight that has come to us. One of the big learnings for me is something called noticing the difference between our intent and our impact. How many times have people come to us, you know, I did it with the best of intention. And it's like, yeah, you did it with the best of intention, but what you did was actually had a pretty negative impact on me. And so that notion of being conscious of my intent and my impact, to be thinking, how might this be received? If I say this, if I do this, what are the possible consequences that are unintended? And can I let go of but my intention was all good? That notion of being responsible for both my intent and my impact. To be able to watch and to crucify my intent, because holding it up and saying, but I meant well. It's like, okay, I just ran over your foot, but I meant well. I was just trying to back up my car. You know, it wasn't my intent to run over your foot. Well, that's lovely, but my foot is still run over. And it's like, well, I didn't see you. My intention wasn't bad. It's like, well, fine, your intention isn't bad, but you ran over my foot. Take responsibility for it. Don't be all defensive. But I didn't need to. Again, it's so easy for us to be defensive around our best intentions. And that defensiveness does not extend eternality. Well, it does extend eternality, because it can feel like eternity that things are going on in this way. So the invitation is hold that high intention and be curious about the impact. And be willing to make the intention secondary to the impact, rather than defending the intent and disregarding the impact that another person experiences. So, in summary, with the story of Passover, with the story of Easter, where are we enslaved? Where are we held prisoner? Just be looking to see where that operation is going on. How do we allow certain things to die? How do we allow certain things to be crucified? To be put on a crucifix and hung out? How do we allow to wander 40 years in the desert that we just haven't gotten to our desired state. And rather than raging at it, to look at it as to say, I'm needing this time to develop. I'm needing this time to become ready. Again, I can't speak to you, but I can certainly speak that I did things before I was ready. I got married not ready enough to know enough about myself to know, hey, I'm not really attracted to women. A little awkward here. I'm married to a woman, and a fundamental belief of mine that I would still have is I would want my lover, my partner, to be so beloved by me. And so being married to a woman would never give her that. But I didn't know enough about myself to do that or to recognize it. And I've talked before, my divorce was not the most cheery, pleasant, unfolding story. It was a story where I got, where I worked for a lot of sympathy. In terms of resurrection, how do we see every moment as a moment of new life? Even in the midst of difficulty, how do we own this new moment that we step into as new life? How do we celebrate it with a sense of awe and welcome? We may not be feeling that, but how do we hold the intent, and how do we offer the impact that this moment, and then this moment, and then this moment, each of these moments is an undeserved gift. We can be holding on to the idea that I'm alive, I should get this. That feeling of entitlement. I don't know about you, but I find that when I'm around people that have this action and this orientation and this attitude of entitlement, little pieces of my soul I draw them back in. I'm not all that thrilled around that notion of entitlement. But let it serve as a reminder for me, how am I keeping myself in a position of entitlement? How do I let this moment, and this moment, and this moment, each one of those moments be a place of excitement, be a place of, I give thanks. And even if the energy level isn't high, even if the energy level is this, and our emotional level is this, how do we still hold ourselves to the question of, how do I celebrate this moment? So every sunrise, every sunset, every moonrise, every moonset, every meal, every time going to the bathroom, every moment is a new moment. Rise up and live in that new moment, in this new moment right now. And so it is.